And now I'm joined by the yin to my yang over the past year, and that's Eric Harder. How you doing tonight, Eric?
I prefer to be the yin to your ling, to be quite honest with you.
What's that mean?
Dude, come on.
Oh, Yingling. Oh, like the beer? Yeah, because it's horrible beer. That's why I didn't recognize what you were saying. So obviously this is our 1 year anniversary. Big show for us. In just a second, we're going to be joined by a guest. First time ever having him on this show, at least. JJ Zachariason. But first, we're going to go over some news and notes for the week. Eric, do you know where Adrian Peterson signed this week?
Yeah, with a team that's paying him $8 million a year, I think.
Okay. So
wait.
No, that one. Where did Jamal Charles sign?
Negatory.
Tony Romo?
John Elway is not interested.
Colin Kaepernick?
No comment.
Has Josh Gordon been reinstated?
Dude looks chiseled. I don't know if you saw that picture.
He does. All right, well, that's it for the news and notes. Now we're joined by JJ Zachariason of Number Fire and Living the Stream podcast. How you doing tonight, JJ?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Absolutely wonderful. It's great to have you on. I know this is the first time having you on this show, and it's kind of apropos because even though it's our 1 year anniversary, we're still having some first time things on the show. We had our new audio editor Shane on earlier for his first time guest too. So it's good to finally have you on. So the theme of the night is, what have you learned this week in fantasy? And we'll start off with you, JJ. What did you learn this year?
I learned to never trust Michael Floyd.
He was really drunk.
Yeah, he was not great. No, in all seriousness, I mean, I think there's a lot that went down this year, especially when comparing and contrasting to what went down the previous season from a fantasy standpoint. But I think that one thing that was a big takeaway for me with regards to dynasty wideouts is that there's still more to just sheer talent and opportunity. And what I mean by that is, when you look at the four positions in fantasy football, the four main positions, wide receiver of those four are the third most volatile, or second most volatile, I should say. Tight ends being the most volatile of any position in the sport. Quarterbacks being the most consistent, and running backs being next. And the reason for that is kind of obvious, where wide receivers rely heavily on that quarterback play. Whereas quarterbacks, for instance, are kind of free and they control their own destiny, if you will, because they're touching the ball so many times in a given game. So enter Allen Robinson and DeAndre Hopkins, two guys who I don't think many would disagree are some of the most talented wide receivers in the game. They had plenty of opportunity this season, and they ended up being fairly mediocre assets. And I think that it was kind of alarming. I don't think we've seen such talent and opportunity in that mix kind of just fall off the face of the earth the way that it happened with those two guys this season in particular. And I think that it's just an example of, it's easy to not think about quarterback position enough with the wide receiver position. And I think that with those two guys, obviously with Blake Bortles taking a big step back and regressing naturally, which is kind of what a lot of us expected. Obviously, Brock Osweiler ended up being a downgrade from Brian Hoyer in Houston. I just think that it's one thing to always keep an eye on, and it's a learning lesson, I think, for folks who really put a lot of stock in the talent side and the opportunity side above kind of the team situation.
Isn't it amazing that people just ragged on Brian Hoyer forever? And yeah. I mean, he made Josh Gordon into a star. He didn't make Josh Gordon into a star, but he was a supporting role in that, and also DeAndre Hopkins, and then Osweiler was thought to maybe be an upgrade. So everybody took Hopkins. Who are some guys maybe this year that you're looking at their quarterback situation as being maybe a downgrade from what it was the year, last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could still, if anyone's still high on anyone in Cleveland, you should feel a little questionable about that. I mean, Corey Coleman, hopefully he can stay healthy all year, and he'll probably see a decent amount of volume even with Kenny Britt there. But again, what kind of volume is he seeing? I think that's one that definitely would have to jump out. We still have to be a little bit worried about DeAndre Hopkins again. If they're not doing anything in Houston, if they don't get Romo, if they're running Tom Savage out there, I don't think that you should feel all that confident. Not only that, but you have a guy developing in Will Fuller across from him, and he could steal some looks as well. So I think those are again two situations that you kind of have to be a little bit worried about. And again, if Blake Bortles doesn't progress, you have the same situation with Allen Robinson. I mean, it's not, I do think that he'll take a step forward this year naturally, but Blake Bortles is bad. And you shouldn't feel overly confident because of what he did 2 years ago, strictly from a statistical standpoint, the raw statistical standpoint, because we all know that his actual performance didn't look nearly as good as the amount of touchdowns, for instance, that he threw that year.
It's funny. I wrote down three things that I was going to discuss, things I learned this year, and I feel like I could talk about any one of them right now because they're all kind of tangential to what you just mentioned. So I'll just go in order, and I'm going to bring up the running backs. So you talked about being a little bit steadier, and Carl, you and I have had this argument a few times about where they kind of stand in the hierarchy, the positional hierarchy in Dynasty, where everyone's sort of craving that longevity in addition to the year-to-year, game-to-game. But I'm still sticking with my guns that I believe that elite running backs are worth paying for. And so when I looked into the numbers a little while back, if you compare the top 12 PPR running backs between 2015 and 2016, there was a 21% increase in carries, 26% increase in rush yards, 35% increase in rush TDs, and even a 20% increase in receiving TDs. And you look at the wide receivers, conversely, the top 12 PPR guys, they lost 12% of targets, 11% of receptions, 14% of yards, and 10% in touchdowns. Now, maybe this will just be a snapshot in time, and a year from now, I'll have a lot of egg on my face. But what we do know is that when you look at these running backs, we have your David Johnsons, your Le'Veon Bells, Ezekiel Elliott, Melvin Gordon, Devontae Freeman. These are young guys. These are guys who young guys in good offenses, I should say. So the only thing that's going to stop them is the age-old injury argument. So, I mean, we're looking at guys who, if you compare them to the wide receivers, they were the league winners last year. And as I mentioned, they're young, talented, on good offenses. If I'm trying to project even in a 3-year window, which is still probably a little bit foolish, I think, and you're even seeing it a little bit in the ADP now, I think people are now gravitating towards taking some of these guys a little bit earlier.
It's funny that was Jason's thing that he learned this year is he wanted stud running backs. How are you viewing stud running backs, JJ, in the hierarchy of like the first round of a dynasty startup draft? Are you going after the stud wide receivers, or do you want to get a running back?
Yeah, I mean, it generally depends on where I am, but I'm not opposed to going running back early. I think I definitely skew more towards wide receiver just because of the reasons that we all know. The predictability in terms of year to year and the longer term value that you get with those positions. But like you mentioned, I mean, the running back position, last season, if you had a stud running back, it gave you the single greatest edge of any player at any position. So if you are, for instance, in a win now mode, I totally am for trying to obtain or trying to hold on to some of those stud running backs because they do, and especially like you guys mentioned. I mean, the guys that are in the league now, they're young, they are mostly 3-down backs, they're in good offenses. And you can make an argument that they will be around for 3-4 more years. And if they are going to give you that sustained success, then that's the single greatest edge that you can have in fantasy football. Now, granted, it was a down year for stud wide receivers, and it was a fairly up year for running backs simply because of the amount of touchdowns they scored. That was a huge reason for it. So, I try to not, even like after last season happened, I tried not to fall in the trap of, okay, now I'm going to avoid the running back position, or now, if I'm doing a startup, or now I'm not going to invest in the position. I try to just stay as even keeled as I possibly can, because in the end, when you look at that 3 to 4 year snapshot, it's going to look fairly even. It's just that we take these highs and lows each season, depending on how things go down, whether it's injury related or not.
In the 2016 season, I think would have looked a lot differently if David Johnson got hurt at a different time.
Yeah.
Than the time he got hurt. We're also forgetting that Todd Gurley was right up there, drafted just with those other 3 guys, if not before them, in a lot of dynasty leagues. And as you mentioned, I think it was just a down year for wide receivers. Now, I do want to give Jason a little bit of credit. He said it earlier. I want to give Eric a little bit of credit. The stud running backs, you can ride them to a title. I mean, David Johnson, if you look at MFL 10s, it was Johnson, Zeke, and Bell who were on most of the championship teams. So, you know, I know Eric hates it when I bring up MFL 10s because we don't really talk redraft here on this podcast. But while it's dynasty, we're still talking about winning that year. That's still the goal, is winning that year. So, I mean, I get it. I guess let me pose this question to both of you. Would you rather have whoever's your third favorite running back of the three? So toss out your favorite two. Would you rather have, I'll ask you first, Eric. Would you rather have your third favorite running back of those three, or would you rather have Michael Thomas?
The running back.
What about you, JJ?
I'd probably go with the running back as well.
I just feel like I would go Michael Thomas, and I know I'm like being hypocritical from how I used to be like 2-3 years ago, in that I wanted to win every year, but I see what happens with Doug Martin, who was taken first overall in 2013 in many dynasty league drafts. In the leagues that he didn't go first overall, it was Trent Richardson. We have guys like Mark Ingram, who probably went over Julio Jones and AJ Green that year at 2011 rookie drafts, and we just see it every year. You know, we had Eddie Lacy and Gio Bernard go over DeAndre Hopkins in that year's rookie draft. So yeah, you're going to get some short-term production. That Trent Richardson rookie year was awesome. Statistically, at least, he had those 10 touchdowns, but the running backs just tail off so quickly, and I'm in it for the long haul.
I would say too, just to add and give a little bit more context, I think those three are also incredibly special in terms of the way that we should be viewing them, because you have two guys in David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell who are obviously like low-end wide receiver twos alone, right? And then you have a guy in Zeke who, even if you're not all that optimistic about his potential in the receiving game, at least you know that the team themselves, whether it's smart or not, and my take is it's not, but you know that the team itself, the way they're trying to win, is literally just utilizing the absolute hell out of them, right? And so I think that because of all of that combined, you have these situations that are very, very unique. I think that there's just a massive, massive drop-off once you get past those three guys.
And JJ, I think you and I,
go ahead.
I just was going to mention that I think JJ and I were probably the two most vocal on Twitter about how horrible of a draft pick Zeke Elliott was over Jalen Ramsey. Not from a fantasy standpoint, not right. You know, he goes great behind that line. But I also wanted to mention, if you don't think they're going to be winning a lot of games, that defense got worse, and they're not going to be ahead from the beginning, because Zeke Elliott, his game script was pretty much perfect last year. Mm-hmm. So I'm afraid of that. What were you going to say, Eric?
No, I was going to say, playing devil's advocate to myself, I will admit that wide receivers with down years, we talked about Allen Robinson, Nuke Hopkins, they're still mid-first round startup picks. So you have a little bit more insulation if you have those types of underperforming assets. But, you know, if it goes the way of Cordero Patterson, possibly Dante Moncrief, if he keeps not doing a lot, I mean, they will eventually tail off as well.
How about Allen Robinson versus your third favorite running back?
All
right, so I at least got you thinking. So you still have A-Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're right about even at this point.
I agree.
So both y'all would have Allen Robinson easily over Michael Thomas?
Yeah.
I don't know how easy it would be. You know, I think Michael Thomas is close to the Zeke area for me, but I can see the argument, but I still think that I would take the running back over. I would probably still take him over A-Rob.
I've been getting really hyped up over Michael Thomas this year. Like I think you could pretty much make the case, other than OBJ, like there's not a dynasty asset that's like a lot better than him.
Could see it. I mean, like I totally get the argument. I totally get it. I think the bottom line, and the way that I'm just viewing it in general, is again the true. I mean, we all agree that the true the biggest difference makers is at the running back position. And to me, it's just very, very, very clear at this point in time who those guys are, which I don't think we've had this much clarity in a really long time, right?
We just say that every year, though.
I know. No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But like I said, I think that, you can look at a Trent Richardson, for instance, and we can say it feels to me like the commitment, for instance, isn't necessarily the same from just a pure NFL standpoint, a pure team standpoint, right? I know that it's very easy to say
Browns
something
have
like
an
that.
okay offensive line.
Yeah, I know it's very, very easy to say something like that in hindsight, right? Because they traded him for a first round pick, but it's to me like I said, Zeke is my 3, so like he's the guy that I'm just referencing all the time here. But like to me, it just seems like number one, the Cowboys are going to be more competitive than the Browns ever would have been, because they at least have what we think is a very good potential a star at quarterback, and that to me is kind of just keeping me okay with going with a guy like Zeke over a guy like A-Rob.
And then, I mean, I love Allen Robinson. Some might call it an unnatural love. There's a chance he could not have as good a fantasy career as Doug Martin. That's possible at this point. Doug Martin had 2 elite running back years. Right now, Allen Robinson has had 1 good year.
That's true. But with as much trading as going on, did anybody really keep Doug Martin after that 1 great year?
Probably not. Like I said, there's a little bit more insulation for the wide receivers. I'm with you on that.
That was kind of the logic I used last year when Kristen Michael kind of started going off, is all the people that drafted him, what was it, like 20 years ago? Are they really still the same people who had him last year? I want to ask both of you, and either one of you can jump in. I know this kind of put you on the spot. Is there anything that you were very adamant about before this year and you had to just say, you know what, I was wrong?
I'm never wrong. No, I'm just kidding. I'm wrong all the time. I will say one thing that I'm very numbers driven, and so one thing that I think it's a cheap way to buy low, and I worked a lot harder, or to use to buy low, and I worked a lot harder on it this past offseason, is just simple touchdown regression, because I think it's one of the best ways to exploit the average dynasty player who's not going to necessarily think about that kind of stuff off the top of their head. So to me, knowing what I know about touchdowns and how they're fairly random to a degree, it's really easy, especially if you're if you're looking short window and you're seeing a guy severely underperformed 1 year. Obviously, a very easy example of this is Mike Evans, but I'm not saying that went out and just bought it, because everyone knew that to a degree, because he only scored like 3 touchdowns 2 years ago. But
2, I think.
Yeah, 2. So it's the lesser, the guys that are a little bit lower in the ranks that you can kind of just get cheaper just because they don't have that much of a resume backing them. One guy last season that I bought a lot of was Jamison Crowder, just because he didn't have those touchdown numbers there. And then we saw the next season the boomerang effect and the overcorrection. And then he scored too many touchdowns this past year compared to how many he should have. But a lot of that happens a lot of times. Julian Edelman, it happened to him. Devontae Adams, it happened with him as well. Obviously, he became a lot better of a wide receiver. But that's one thing that I didn't focus enough on when it pertained to dynasty, just because I thought so long term with my dynasty prospecting and whatnot. It was much more of a redraft focus, but thinking more with touchdown regression in terms of dynasty was a big learning for me over the last year or two, just to get kind of those cheapies, just given their 1 year, 1 or 2 year performances they had down touchdown years.
Yeah, one thing that I kind of looked at last offseason was, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago with Matt Harmon, was the concept of NFL skill translating to fantasy box scores. And one big way that I went about doing that was looking at, for receivers, how many receiving first downs did they have when compared to like the total amount of receiving first downs versus what was their target share. And ideally you would like that numerator to be a lot bigger than that denominator. And a couple of guys that I highlighted as guys who were getting like a large proportion of their teams receiving first downs telling me that even if they didn't have like these amazing fantasy years, if they're good in the NFL, they're going to like stay on the field and get better. And eventually this will translate into fantasy, points. 3 guys that I really targeted were Alshon Jeffrey, Kamar Aiken, and Willie Snead. And, Snead, he was probably the one success story out of the 3, but the other 2, I mean, they just still didn't really do anything with Aiken. I mean, he just didn't get on the field. So maybe that was just kind of a confluence of events for him in 2015. But yeah, I think that was that is something I kind of missed on a little bit.
And I'll ask both of you. I'll start with you, JJ. It kind of going off of both of y'all's points. Eric saying, first downs are valuable. And you mentioned Jamison Crowder as somebody who didn't catch a lot of touchdowns. How about a guy like Jarvis Landry? Where do you I know pretty much everyone has a strong feeling one way or the other on Jarvis Landry. Where do you land with him?
I'm very much someone who tries to balance my rosters. I'm not going to go at you and say Jarvis Landry sucks or Jarvis Landry is amazing.
We need one or the other.
Yeah, right.
It's civil war here.
The main reason for it is I will take a guy like Jarvis Landry and balance him out with a more volatile week-to-week guy. It's just generally the way that I approach the game. So if I have a high variance squad, especially a wide receiver, and I need that baseline, that's when I'm going to go after a Jarvis Landry, Jamison Crowder type player. But the difference being that Crowder in general. So I use for touchdown regression specifically is our net expected points metric, which goes to what you were talking about, Eric, because it will favor first downs more, an expected points model. It'll favor a guy who converts a 3rd and 10. And gets 11, 12 yards to convert. It'll favor them a bit, but obviously we know that fantasy football is favored so heavily and skewed so heavily by touchdowns, for instance. So if you're doing well within an expected points model, then that means you're a good football player. It just doesn't necessarily mean that it's translated directly to what the fantasy box score is saying. So, Jarvis Landry is, we know a bit what he is at this point. There was a little bit more ambiguity with Jamison Crowder. There still kind of is in terms of upside, but I'm fine with having a guy like Jarvis Landry as long as the other pieces on my squad kind of dictate that.
So I'm going to touch on Landry specifically in a moment, but this is one of the other things that I wrote down about what I learned is that dynasty owners will go to the graves with their opinions.
Yes.
That's just the way it is. People, a year's passed and a lot of things don't change. We talked about Robinson and Hopkins are still first-round startup picks, and they're going ahead of a guy like T.Y. Hilton, who to me, all he does is produce. And I think I'm at the point where I would actually take Hilton over either one of those. Landry, specifically, you mentioned, he's the 25th highest player in ADP, which isn't bad, but he's had a wide receiver 3, a wide receiver 1, and a high-end wide receiver 2 season now in his 3 years. Doug Baldwin, wide receiver 1 the past 2 years, is the 28th player. Moncrief is still a top 40 guy, even though he hasn't done a lot. And maybe the most egregious thing, a guy like Randall Cobb is ahead of Michael Crabtree and Emmanuel Sanders for some reason, even though they've actually been performing on the field. So why I highlighted Landry in that is because I do feel that when people choose to be definitive with him, it's generally on the I want a higher upside, flashier guy. And so me personally circling back, Carl, I'm all about the higher floor and the consistency on the week to week. And, ideally you would have the best of both worlds, but there are only so many Julios and OBJs and AJ Greens in the league. So you're not going to get that with more than but a handful of players. So with Landry, I know he wasn't quite as good from a consistency standpoint last year as he was the year before, but the year before, I think he was something crazy like at least a weekly wide receiver 3 in 14 or 15 of his 16 games. So, he's more expensive now than he was then, when you probably could have got him at the 5th or 6th round in a startup prior to last year. But I'm still okay with that because he's been through multiple coaching staffs now, multiple pieces around him, and he still seemingly has a pretty safe role.
Yeah, I think having that slot role, being good at that, we've seen Welker in the past, Julian Edelman in the past and present. We've seen guys like Jarvis Landry and Jamison Crowder now. When people say they're just not a good wide receiver because they're comparing them to flankers and split ends, they don't play the same position. So when you're looking at efficiency metrics, I just don't think it's fair to put those guys in, compare them to actually guys that are running deeper routes. It's just not a fair comparison, in my opinion.
Right. And generally speaking, those guys are going to see more volume, right? So like a Landry, an Edelman, a Crowder potentially, as we move forward, those guys are going to combat that inefficiency with more volume.
Yeah. And it goes to, I've said it a few times on the podcast before, that those type players are safety valves in that the play doesn't have to be designed for them to get the ball. They could be the second, third, fourth progression for a quarterback, and they get that. That's why they get more targets. It's not as though Miami or Washington or New England is designing plays to go to Jarvis Landry, Jamison Crowder, or Julian Edelman, respectively. It's because when the play breaks down, that's the guy you check down to. And in the world of fantasy football, in the world of PPR, which most of us play, and on this podcast we usually assume PPR, those type guys are underrated. I think that's one thing that maybe it sounds like all of us kind of learned this past year.
Yeah.
All right, JJ, I want to thank you for rolling over to Denny's mom's basement to do the podcast, even though the electricity's out.
Yeah. I got dimmer and dimmer on here as the show went on, but I did turn on a light finally, so that's good. I appreciate you guys having me though.
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow JJ at late round. What is it? Late round quarterback? You don't spell out quarterback. This is usually I'm prepared. I'm a man. I'm a podcast host. I've been doing.
Cool, man. We've only been following each other for about 7 years now. No, it's late round QB.
All right. And you can follow Eric at EDH_27. And we'll be back in just a second with another guest. All right, cool, guys. So I think I mentioned to Eric. So basically we recorded a bunch of segments. This is going to be like the middle one since it's the guest segment.
Cool. Awesome. Appreciate
All right. Well,
it,
thanks
fellas.
again, man.
Yeah, thanks,
guys.
man.
No problem.
Yeah, guys. Take it easy.
See you.
You too. So yeah, happy 1 year, man.
Yeah, that's crazy. Like,
Right.
You know what's really funny is that did you saw Kevin's tweet about getting sniped at like the 5 minute mark again? I'm like, oh yeah, happy 1 year.
Dude, he's been messaging me a lot lately. This is probably not something I should say on the air. Hold on, let me I know Shane doesn't mess that up, but